Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Brad Berzer here for American Heritage. We have only 3 classes left, amazingly so. What a semester. So, this is our third from last class. I hope you guys are all doing well. Hope that you're able to keep up with the readings. And please don't forget that you have your second paper due for me this Friday by midnight, and I would like you to email me those as PDFs, and you are welcome to use either the prompt for the second paper that I have listed on the syllabus or the third paper. So the due date is the same as the third paper, but because we're only doing 2 papers because of the coronavirus rather than the 3, you are welcome to write on either prompt 2 or 3 for that, or some derivation thereof. So obviously, I don't want you to do any research for that. These are liberal arts essays, and they are meant to be at least derived for the most part from your American Heritage reader. So if that's all you use, that's perfectly fine. And that's what we're expecting. If you want to go beyond your Heritage reader, that's up to you. But I would encourage you really to write this only based on the Heritage reader for your own sanity and your own sake. We also, as I mentioned in the last email, and as you all know, we also have finals coming up. And I will get a study guide to you for that. But in preparation for that, I do want to remind everybody that there are set times for those finals. So I don't remember exactly what those are right now, but the college has already set those times. If for whatever reason, though, you are not able to take your test at the time that has been allotted to us, then you need to let me know, and we need to get something scheduled relatively soon. So we don't want that creeping up on us right before right before the finals themselves. That could be kind of, bad for all of us. So anyway, do let me know. Okay, what else do we know? I know that your course evaluations went out yesterday, I think, through Blackboard. At least I got an email saying they went out. So I would appreciate it if you guys would evaluate me when you get a chance. And I'm assuming that you guys have time for that. And let me see, there was at least one other thing. I think, yes, this is it. I'm pretty sure I've answered all emails that you guys have sent to me. But if for some reason I haven't, it means I probably didn't get it. So if you do have an email for me that I didn't answer, please do let me know, and I will get that answered as quickly as possible. Okay, so let's get into the class today. That was about 4 or 5 minutes there of just housekeeping stuff. So let's get into the class. And I want this class to be a follow-up, even though chronologically that took place about 25 years after what we're talking about. I do want this class to be about communism in the 1950s. So I want it to be a follow-up to what you saw in the Gulag scene from the killing fields. And I would like you to keep in mind that as we're talking about the 1940s and the 1950s and getting into our current era, that this is really the beginning. 1946, 1947, we really see the beginning of what we call the Cold War. And we have to keep that into context. The communists, mostly out of Russia, not completely. There were a few independent kind of communists running around. But for the most part, out of the Soviet Union, which, praise the Lord, no longer exists. But for the most part, the Soviet Union had really been the leading power among the communists. And if we were to look at the world in, say, 1950, we would see a world that was almost evenly divided between communist powers and non-communist powers. So I don't want you to get the sense that, like now, where we really just have China as our great kind of adversary, and then we have a few other powers lingering around that are sometimes in alliance with China and sometimes not, like North Korea and Iran and a few other powers. I don't want you to think that there's kind of a loose confederacy. There was, in fact, a very tight confederacy around the communists, and the fact that they controlled almost half the world was a very serious threat in terms of our ability to move, our ability to do what we needed to do to live a very American lifestyle, and simply for our ability to control resources. It was difficult, and the world was very divided. And we also have to remember, and I hope this was pretty clear from you watching that Gulag scene in Cambodia in 1975 and 76, that communism was every bit as evil as was Nazism. Really, when we went from fighting the Nazis in a hot war to fighting the Soviets in a cold war, we really just exchanged one demonic force for another. I mean, these are truly evil in all kinds of ways. And the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and all of their satellite powers, they really did run their countries on that Gulag style. And the Gulag became absolutely essential to Soviet rule or Cambodian rule, Chinese rule to this day. What do we estimate that there are probably 2 million Chinese Muslims in their gulag, and that's just the Muslims. You can imagine who else is in those gulags. These are horrible, right? Absolutely horrible. And I would never hold up the American prison system as some kind of ideal prison system. But clearly, our prison systems are not death camps, and they're not meant to completely remake the person in the way that you saw in communism. They tried to destroy the family, they tried to destroy education, they tried to destroy individual identity. It was a horrific time, and the Soviets were not some minor power. And I realize that many of you have grown up reading about my era and reading about my mother's era, that is the 1950s for my mom, 1980s for me, and thinking that our Cold War was kind of a joke and that all we had to do was duck and cover. These were serious times, and the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over everything all the time. I still, even at age 52, I don't have them as much as I used to. It kind of stopped about 10 years ago. But I used to just have horrific nightmares about nuclear annihilation. And believe me, I'm not alone. I will admit I'm not the most normal guy on earth, but almost everybody of my generation had or still has those kinds of dreams. I can see mine vividly, absolutely vividly, because I had the same dream over and over and over again about nuclear annihilation. And they're terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And we grew up with that. So I also grew up in Kansas, very close to a nuclear missile field, where we would have been first strike. Had the Soviets ever hit, we would have been the first to go. So, and maybe that would have been a blessing, but I mean, it was terrible. One of my closest friends had a Firebird Camaro, and it was fast. And we used to keep supplies in the back of his trunk in case we ever did hear of a first strike, because we knew we would have about 20 minutes. And we used to try and figure out, going at roughly full speed, about 120, how fast could we get out of town? How far could we get before the missile strikes hit? I mean, it's high school fantasy, of course. And we had been probably very influenced by Red Dawn and The Day After. But there's no doubt that we did take it seriously, and we tried to figure out what we could do to get away from it. Okay, my point is, this stuff was really serious. So I think we can look back, because we won and we got out of it, and there was no nuclear disaster, and kind of happily and with much relief laugh about it. But it was truly serious at the time. So remember, during World War II, the Soviets had been, at least nominally, our ally. And Franklin Roosevelt had thought very highly of Joseph Stalin as a friend and as a fellow world leader. And so we did feel, in many ways, especially after the things like the Alger Hiss problem and the fact that the Soviets had stolen our nuclear technology in order to develop the hydrogen bomb, we felt that is, the American people felt very betrayed, and for good reasons. We felt very betrayed. The American people had been sold a series of lies under Franklin Roosevelt about the nature of the Soviet Union. The idea that the Soviet Union was merely a proto-democracy, and that if we could influence her, she would become democratic. And the Soviets lied to us openly. So not only did our American people, that is, our American leaders, lie to us, but the Soviets lied to us. And all of that came out right after World War II because the Soviets refused to live up to their promises that they had made during the war. And not only did they refuse to live up to their promises, but they began to enslave people everywhere. And this was horrific. And the American people had to figure out what did this mean. And this was the beginning of the Cold War. Now, one of the greatest and most important changes at the beginning of the Cold War was simply that we no longer had Franklin Roosevelt in charge of the American government because he passed away of natural causes in 1945. And at that point, his very last minute, and again, praise the Lord for this, but his very last minute adoption for a vice president was a man from Missouri by the name of Harry Truman. And Truman, for all of his faults, understood very well how utterly evil the Soviet Union was. And he was aghast at the kind of relationship that we had with Joseph Stalin. And so he had to take the place of Franklin Roosevelt during those post-war meetings with Stalin. And when Stalin refused to live up to his agreements, Truman read him the Riot Act. And at one point, and Truman was very, very blunt, and because I'll have to forgive me, I'm going to be PG-13 here for a moment. But when Stalin said to Truman, I cannot believe the way you're treating me. Your predecessor would have never treated me this way. Truman said, blah, blah, you can insert your own cuss words there. If you'd live up to your damn agreements, I wouldn't have to talk to you this way. And that was Truman. And really, Truman was great for that, but we had to change tactics. And Truman told Stalin. Sorry, I'm laughing because I'm not telling you the actual words he said, but I'll let you use your imagination for those. Okay, so let's turn to page 765 in the Reader, and we'll look here at what is the Truman Doctrine. The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today necessitates my appearance before a joint session of Congress. Notice the date, March 12th of 1947. The foreign policy and the national security of this country are involved. One aspect of the present situation which I wish to present to you at this time for your consideration and decision concerns Greece and Turkey. The United States has received from the Greek government an urgent appeal for financial and economic assistance. Preliminary reports from the American Economic Mission now in Greece and reports from the American ambassador in Greece corroborate the statement of the Greek government that assistance is imperative if Greece is to survive as a free nation. The British government has informed us that, owing to its own difficulties, can no longer extend financial or economic aid to Turkey. As in the case of Greece, if Turkey is to have the assistance it needs, the United States must supply it. We are the only country able to provide help. I am fully aware of the broad implications involved if the United States extends assistance to Turkey and Greece, and I shall discuss these implications with you at this time. One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion. This was the fundamental issue in the war with Germany and Japan. Our victory was won over countries which sought to impose their will and their way of life upon other nations. To ensure the peaceful development of nations free from coercion, the United States has taken a leading part in establishing the United Nations. The United Nations is designed to make possible lasting freedom and independence for all of its members. We shall not realize our objectives, however, unless we are willing to help free peoples to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon totalitarian regimes. Now, whether we agree with Truman or not, he is saying here very specifically that a United Nations without United States military backing is no United Nations at all. That if we truly do believe that we are trying to defend a way of life that will allow a nation freely to be a nation, and its people to move across the oceans without coercion, we must use military backing paid for by the United States, supplied by United States men and women, and that we must be the guarantor of peace in the world. Right? So we shall not realize our objectives, however, unless we are willing to help free peoples to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon them totalitarian regimes. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed on a free people by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. The peoples of a number of countries of the world have recently had totalitarian regimes forced upon them against their will. Now, he's clearly talking about the Soviet Union, our ally only 2 years earlier. But now they've become our greatest enemy. And Truman recognizes that. And that's whiplash for the American people to go from the Soviets being our ally and our noble brothers in the war against the Germans and the Nazis to suddenly being an enemy equal to the Nazis. Now, the second part is absolutely true. First part was a lie. First part was based on a delusion that somehow we could manipulate Soviet tyranny. Of course we couldn't. This is like trying to dance with the devil. When you do, you have to dance to his tune. And there was no way that we could ever have made nice with the Soviet Union. It was a complete lie, and it was an intentional lie on the part of the American government. But now the American government has to basically confess. We lied. And these people are evil. And now we have to do something about it. Oh, and by the way, yes, we did strengthen their regime, and we gave them tanks, and we gave them food, and we gave them all kinds of cooperation and encouragement. But now those very same things are being used against us. Again, whiplash. So the peoples of a number of countries of the world have recently had totalitarian regimes forced upon their will. The government of the United States has made frequent protests against coercion and intimidation in violation of the Yalta Agreement in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. I must also state that in a number of other countries there have been similar developments, right? We're going to get involved in a war, a very messy war, conflict actually. It was never decreed a war, but a conflict in Korea. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority, and it's distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedoms of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. So those are the alternatives. You either side with the free world, or you side with those on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the communist world. So you may either be free or totalitarian. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes. The world is not static and the status quo is not sacred, but we cannot allow changes in the status quo in violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Notice again how interesting it is that the United States will become the governor of the world through the United Nations. And the United Nations will become, in many ways, a screen for what the United States' actual agenda is. By such methods of coercion or by subterfuges as political infiltration. In helping free and independent nations to maintain their freedom, the United States will be giving effect to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. It is necessary only to glance at a map to realize that the survival and integrity of the Greek nation are of grave importance in a much wider situation. If Greece should fall under the control of an armed minority, the effect upon its neighbor Turkey would be immediate and serious. Confusion and disorder might well spread throughout the entire Middle East. There's a shock. there might be confusion in the Middle East. Moreover, the disappearance of Greece as an independent state would have a profound effect upon the countries in Europe, whose peoples are struggling against great difficulties to maintain their freedoms and their independence while they repair the damages of war. It would be an unspeakable tragedy if these countries, which have struggled so long against overwhelming odds, should lose that victory for which they sacrificed so much. Collapse of free institutions and the loss of independence would be disastrous, not only for them, but for the lot of neighboring peoples striving to maintain their freedom and independence. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be a far-reaching one to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate action. And then, of course, he gives us the numbers and what he's asking for. But it's more than that. I'd skip the paragraph there on how much this is going to cost, which was a lot. But in addition to funds, I asked the Congress to authorize the detail of American civilian and military personnel to Greece and Turkey at the request of those countries to assist in the task of reconstruction and for the purpose of supervising the use of such financial and material assistance as may be furnished. I recommend the authority also be provided for the instruction and training of select Greek and Turkish personnel. In other words, we're going to be shaping their militaries. This is a serious course upon which we embark. I would not recommend it except that the alternative is more serious. Jump down a paragraph. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are natured by misery and want. I think he meant nurtured, but natured. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation. Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. I am confident that the Congress will face these responsibilities squarely. But of course, what Truman is not saying is that everybody already behind Soviet lines, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, those people, tough luck. You got caught behind those lines, and we're just going to abandon you to the Soviet people and to the Soviet rule and Soviet tyranny and the Gulag. So it's very, very kind in many ways of Truman to say we're going to stop Soviets from going into any new countries and saying that we're doing this for humanitarian reasons. But in fact, we had just totally betrayed our allies in World War II. Remember, the entire Second World War begins because the Soviets and the Nazis carved up Poland. We turn around and ally ourselves with one of the two greatest butchers in the history of the world, Stalin as opposed to Hitler. And so when we do that, we sell our souls. And we sold our souls in a billion ways. And we sold our souls to the devil. And the consequence is we have left millions of people to rot behind the Iron Curtain. And now Truman is saying, oh, but we'll protect those people who have not been put behind the Iron Curtain yet. And the policy, and you all have to know this, this is a very important term in American history. The policy that Truman is creating is called containment. And the idea of containment, and it will be the policy under all presidents up until 1981, the policy of containment, so this is the policy for Truman, for Eisenhower, for Kennedy, for Johnson, for Nixon, for Ford, and for Carter, right? So for 7 presidents, this will be United States policy that we will create an impenetrable barrier at where the Soviets are in 1947, and we will not let them increase their territory. Now, we fail at this miserably. Containment is an absolutely failed policy. In large part, it's a failed policy because it relies upon materialism as the main way of combating the Soviet Union. It does not recognize, as Whittaker Chambers said, that the real divide between the free world and the non-free world is the issue of faith. issue of faith in God, an issue of faith in man. It does not recognize that, but it says instead that because America is so wealthy that we can use our money not only to remake the militaries of our allies, but to fund and supply them maybe forever in order to contain the Soviet Union. There is no serious proposal that Truman gives, which would have been the honorable proposal of rollback. Rather, it is merely containment. This will lead to our conflict in Korea. It will be our conflict in Vietnam. So this will become the norm, this idea of containment. And again, I cannot stress enough, this is psychologically an impotent policy for the Americans. It is devastating for the people who have been left behind in Soviet countries, and especially the Poles and the Germans. It is expensive, and it is ineffective in almost every way. We know that the Soviet Union will expand. Communism will expand. It will expand everywhere. In the 1970s, communism expanded into Nicaragua, into Honduras, into Angola, into Mozambique, into Afghanistan. So containment was an absolutely failed policy. And that policy, though, will be put into place for the most part until 1981. So we're talking about 30 plus years of a failed policy, but one that we try to implement. One of the most expensive costs of containment is what it does to the American economy. The American economy will will maintain itself after World War II on a war-based footing, because suddenly we have to have all of the latest arms, all of the latest fighters, all of the latest equipment in our policy for containment. And this creates a very interesting, and I would say diabolic, but a very interesting alliance between businesses, the military, and corporations. So you can imagine what kind of city would Seattle be without Boeing? What kind of city would Phoenix be without McDonnell Douglas? I mean, these cities that we have, especially in the West, really are sustained only by this extreme militarism that we have in the American economy during the 1940s all the way up to the present day. It changes the whole demographics of the nation. And so our next president after Truman is, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been not only the great architect of victory against the Nazis during World War II, he had been the general in charge, but he also then becomes the president of Columbia University after the war. He's a pretty effective president of Columbia University, and then he becomes the president of the United States. But if you turn to page 821 in the Reader, we find here his great warning in 1961 in his farewell address. And Eisenhower's farewell address is not quite as famous as Washington's farewell address, but it would be the second most important farewell address in American history, and in large part because of what Eisenhower says here on page 821. If you look down to the second full paragraph on there on 821, he says, "A vital element in keeping the peace in our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction." By the way, if you want a really, really good movie to watch about the Cold War, watch Dr. Strangelove. It is the best Cold War movie there is in terms of showing the absurdity of all this militarization. "Our military organization today bears little relation to that known by any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry." Think about that. We had no armaments industry prior to World War II, except for small guns. That was it. We had a thriving small gun industry, right? Colt Arms, Smith & Wesson, but nothing beyond militia defense, nothing beyond private security, that is, personal security, right? Nothing. So until our latest world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time as required, make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments, got it, industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security more than the net income of all United States corporations. It's huge. Our military budget is greater than the net income of all U.S. military or all U.S. corporations. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every statehouse, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. And there's the term that you must know from the farewell address. The military-industrial complex, this structural hold that the defense industry, not just the Defense Department, but the defense industry, all those manufacturers of tanks, all those manufacturers of large arms, all those manufacturers of bombers and fighters, they have an immense stake in the economy, in the very structure of the economy. There are entire cities now dependent upon defense industries, not corporations, but defense industries, not private business, but defense industries. That's how important this has become. And notice in 1961, we're only about 14 years into the Cold War. And this Cold War is going to last until 91. And of course, it has done the damage by 91. We still have all these defense agencies in place. All of them, all these industries are still in place. So our toil, our resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the world's scholars by federal employment, proper allocations, and the power of money is ever present. This is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that our public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, even aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Right? And that's the danger. The danger is that all of these new corporations will have immense influence. And of course, what will their incentive be? Their incentive will be to keep us in a constant state of alert and war, to get us into wars to test out their weapons, their toys, to see how things work, and to determine the entire shape of the economy. We have never, ever gotten over this. We still, in 2020, are deeply, deeply shaped by our defense institutions, by those very companies that exist almost solely to provide arms. In fact, at this point in the world, now think about that. Prior to World War II, there were no American armaments at all, no industry for that, none. We now account for almost 72% of the world's arms. The United States does. That's a change. That is one huge change. And I'm not talking about Colt or Smith & Wesson. I am talking about major, major weapons, not for personal defense, but for the use of controlling the world. Now, there may be good reason why we need some of that, but at the same time, we have to be very careful, as Eisenhower said, not to let it control the very halls of Congress. They can't become special interests in and of themselves. Well, the last thing I want to talk about today is simply what happens overall to the United States economy. So we haven't talked much about this, and I'm not great at this. I teach every once in a while the course on U.S. economic history, and I very much enjoy it when I teach it, but I'm no economist. I mean, those of you who know me, numbers don't work well with me. I'm very much a humanist in the sense of the humanities in every way. I probably suffer from a form of innumeracy in some way, but regardless, I want to talk about the economy for a moment. If you remember, when we talked about the 19th century economy, there were a couple of things that we could say about it. It was, for almost all intents and purposes, totally private. We had open borders. People could come and go as they wished. We always have had relatively high tariffs, but we never prohibited goods from coming or leaving the United States, coming into or leaving. We had, with Canada especially, the world's largest and freest border in the history of the world. That's gone now, but we had it up until the Patriot Act of the George Bush administration. So we had an almost totally free economy, and even our money was private in the 19th century. Starting in 1913, with the creation of the Federal Reserve, we make money public. That is, we make it a public good rather than a private good. That means, of course, that the U.S. government, through the Federal Reserve and the bankers of the Federal Reserve, can now manipulate the very price of money, something they were never able to do in the 19th century because money was private. Now they can manipulate that. And that means that they can change all kinds of things by being able to control the money supply. They can change much in the economy. Now, we have always been a nation of busts and booms. Our booms always longer than our busts. We went through a tradition in the 19th century where our booms would generally last for about a generation, and our busts would last for about 2 or 3 years. And then we'd go back to boom and then bust. So we had depressions in 1819, in 1837, in 1857, in 1873, and 1893, and then, of course, again in 1920, 21, and then in 1929. That depression of 1929, as we've already talked about, is the very first depression in which the government under Hoover and then Roosevelt threw the full weight of its power against it, trying to stop it. And of course, we know what the result was. It extended it almost seemingly indefinitely. For the first time in our history, a bust became as long as a boom. That bust, the Great Depression, lasted for 17 years, from 1929 until 1946. And then something suddenly happens in 1946. Actually, a couple of somethings happen. And the economy takes off like mad. Absolute mad. There are four things that we can state about the US economy beginning in 1946 and not ending. It's now the longest sustained boom in US history, not ending until 1973. Number one, Truman and Congress removed almost all the price controls that were in place during the Great Depression. Now, the New Deal at its macro level was not removed, but at its micro level, it was. And this accounts for much of the great expansion of the economy after World War II. Number two, there was a great confidence in America after America's victories in World War II. Number three, we had developed during World War II, mostly especially when we think about things like computers and automation, we had developed all kinds of new technology during World War II that will benefit us greatly in peacetime. And finally, number four, we're really the only economy of any strength left standing in Canada too. We're the two great economies left standing at the end of World War II. All of Europe is devastated. They're going to have to rebuild. England has spent herself into extreme poverty and has basically lost her empire. Great sacrifice on their part during World War II, but they're not in any shape to take lead of the of the world economy at that point. Only the United States is. So those four things come together, and we see this amazing boom. In 1946, Fortune magazine said, noticing what was just suddenly being unleashed, the great American boom is on. There is no measuring it. The old yardsticks will not do. There is a powerful consuming demand for everything that one can eat, wear, enjoy, read, repair, paint, drink, see, ride, taste, and rest in. And what do we notice about this economy that grows? Well, there are a couple of things that we can say about it. Some good, some bad. It's all good for poverty. That is, it's good for diminishing poverty. It's good for attacking poverty. But there are things that we find in the American people. Number one, we as Americans become absolutely obsessed. For the first time in our history, we become obsessed with gadgets. Any kind of gadget that seems to simplify our life, we want it. Everything from stuff that we would consider necessities, like refrigerators, to washing machines, sewing machines, vacuum cleaners, freezers, mixers, carving knives, shoe polishers, really about anything that you can imagine. Number two, part of the central growth of the economy was all based on entertainment, and in particular, one thing more than anything else, the television. Television became absolutely huge. Just to give you a couple of numbers, in 1946, there were only 7,000 black and white TVs total in the United States. But by 1960, think about that, just 14 years later, 9 out of every 10 homes had a television in them. And by 1970, about 1 out of every 3 of those were color. So television becomes huge. And there's a whole culture that develops around television. Television shows, television game shows, TV Guide, TV dinners, TV trays. All this just insanity around what was called then the Electronic Hearth, right? The TV replacing the fireplace. And the TV, what do we see with it? We're going to see conformity. One of the reasons that I don't speak like my mother, one of the reasons that you probably don't speak like your grandparents, is because our language has become homogenized. We all sound like the newscasters of the 1970s and 1980s. We've lost our distinctive, for the most part, I still hear every once in a while, accents, but we've lost our accents because we've homogenized our language all around the language of the Midwest, which became the normal language. It became essentially high American English in the United States, or at least the norm of American English. What else do we see about entertainment and the television? Well, it suddenly matters that you're good looking for politics. It really matters. Think about what we talked about with Hiss and Chambers, but imagine what a huge difference being good looking made in the 1960 debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. Richard Nixon actually was, strangely enough, regarded as good looking as a young man, but he refused to wear makeup during the 1960 election. Kennedy was already extremely good looking, and he wore makeup, and he looked really good. It's fascinating. If you take those debates and you have people read them without watching them, Nixon will almost always win. But if you have people watch those debates, Kennedy will almost always win. That's the power of television. We're going to see advertising developing massively in the United States. Well, another thing that we're going to see develop under Eisenhower, and that is the federal highway system, the interstate system. We now have the money to build our own, and yes, they are absolutely inspired by Hitler and the Autobahn. We develop our own interstate commerce system by having this massive development of interstates everywhere. All right, and the last thing I want to say today is that the third thing that we need to see, well, fourth thing, right? So our love of gadgets, let me make sure I got all these right. Our love of gadgets, television as a growth industry, the development of public works such as the interstate highway system, and yes, the fourth thing is the way that women are affected. Remember, in the 1920s, this was the first time that women didn't have to go to work. In the 1950s, we'll see a much greater increase of that because there's so much wealth that basically you only need one household worker working, and the mother can stay at home for the first time. We see the development of what's called the cult of domesticity. That is this kind of rise in the housewife as a great American symbol. So I'm going to just read to you very famously from an article in Life magazine, in which Life magazine describes what the ideal woman of the post-Cold War era is. She is a 32-year-old mother who married at age 16, and she has 4 children. She is an excellent wife. She is an excellent mother, excellent hostess, excellent volunteer, and excellent home manager who makes her own clothes and the clothes of her children. She hosts innumerable dinner parties, and she sings in the church choir. She works with the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, and the Campfire Girls, and she's absolutely devoted to her husband. In her daily rounds, she attends club or charity meetings. She drives the children to school. She does the weekly grocery shopping. She makes ceramics, and she's planning at some point to study French. She also exercises constantly on her trampoline to keep her size 12 figure. Right? That becomes the domestic norm. And that is the cult of domesticity and the kind of almost apotheosis of the house mother. All right, all interesting stuff. So, on our second to last lecture, our next one, we are going to look at Russell Kirk and the question of tradition, the problem of tradition. We are going to look at the new right and the new left. So, let me just make sure that we're all on the same page. I would like you guys for the next class to read The Problem of Tradition by Russell Kirk, as well as the Sharon Statement by Young Americans for Freedom, and the Port Huron Statement, Students for a Democratic Society, and please read Letter from a Birmingham City Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. All right? Great, guys. Thank you. God bless. I hope you're all staying healthy. Stay healthy. There it is. And I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're enjoying your time with your family. Goodbye. Thank you.